everyone, and welcome to Living One. I'm your host, Olivia Crossman. Living One is Kerulos' monthly webinar series, now in its 5th year. With guest speakers from around the world, we listen in to how people are bringing their ethics, minds, and lives into alignment with nature for earth and animal liberation and revitalization. We ask the question, we know what's wrong, but what does right look like? Most importantly, how do we get from wrong to right? When there is so much to change and to heal, where do we begin? What's the first step? What's the path each of us can undertake to make positive, deep, transformative change, not only as individuals, but as a collective whole? What is ours to do? Let's talk about it. This year, Living One hosts and hears from individuals who have forged a range of unique and inspiring paths to help transform and heal Earth, animals, and human society. Join us for another year of rich conversations to learn how, individually and in community, we can take the necessary, concrete, timely steps towards a right world, a world of peace and wellness for all Earth beings. Our guest today is Sandra Bloom. Sandra is a board-certified psychiatrist, graduate of Temple University School of Medicine, and currently Associate Professor of Health Management and Policy at the Dornsife School of Public Health at Drexel University. She is an author or co-author of a series of books on trauma-informed care, is past president of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, and founder and immediate past president of the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice. From 1980 to 2001, Dr. Bloom served as founder and executive director of the Sanctuary Program's inpatient psychiatric programs for the treatment of trauma-related emotional disorders, and during those years was also president of the Alliance for Creative Development, a multidisciplinary outpatient practice group. Dr. Bloom is recognized nationally and internationally as the founder of the Sanctuary model. In extending her work to include an online delivery program called Creating Presence, Dr. Bloom makes the innovative approach to service delivery known as trauma-informed and trauma-responsive more available and cost-effective. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all currently on various Indigenous lands. I am currently on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, which includes the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. This land exists also as a place of trade with other Indigenous communities, including the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Menominee, Sauk, and Meskwaki. The Kerulos Center for Nonviolence is located on the homelands of the grizzly bear, tacoma, daku-betite, coyote, coho salmon, golden eagle, and gray wolf. Finally, we ask that all of us participate with full respect and attention to each other in the spirit of peace and wisdom that Living One seeks to foster. So, without further ado, we welcome Dr. Sandra Bloom.
Hi, Olivia. Hi, everybody. Hi,
Thank
Gay.
you so much for joining us, Sandy.
Sure.
I think Gay was hoping to kick us off with the first question today.
Oh, well, I can wait till the end.
Are you sure, Gay?
I'll get her before she leaves.
Okay, sounds good. Then in that case, Sandy, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you cared about as a child, and was this not encouraged in you?
No, I had a really good childhood, other than I had 5 operations before I was 10.
Mm.
And I think that, but they weren't bad. They weren't terrible experiences. I think that's probably what got me into medicine.
Mm.
What I really cared about, as I was thinking about that question, were books, as you can see behind me. This is my whole house. I haven't read them all. I mean, what would be the point of only having books you've already read? So I have a lot of books, and I cared about trees. And I have one of my fondest memories is laying in a hammock underneath the canopy of trees, reading my books.
Sounds like a dream.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. And this early love of reading in the outdoors, was this encouraged by your family and friends?
Yes, my dad had a beautiful, huge garden. And they moved, they were both city kids. And as soon as they could, they moved us to a house in the suburbs, which were just opening when I was very young. And so we had this beautiful property with grass and plenty of space for my dad's garden.
That sounds wonderful.
It was really nice.
So then what is it that you do today? We read all of your art in your bio, but if you want to give us a little bit more information as to what your present work and view is today.
My present work is that I teach 5 courses about trauma, 1 to undergrads and 4 to graduate students at Drexel University in the School of Public Health. And the reason I stopped practicing probably around the turn of the century, shortly thereafter, because it had become, the economic environment for healthcare had become so adverse. I just couldn't do it anymore. And I couldn't do what I thought was right anymore. And I, got into working with organizations. And as I kind of expanded my own conscious awareness of what was going on in the world, I just got into bigger and bigger and bigger systems and started to really understand that we are in the middle of a public health mess. And so that's how I ended up teaching in the School of Public Health, and now trying to, because I'm kind of an odd person there. I'm a physician. I'm not a PhD in public health, and I'm teaching about trauma, and nobody else there is. So it's starting to catch on. I think other people are starting, particularly young, the students. So I just love teaching the young people and seeing where they're at, and because they're the future.
Beautiful. You mentioned the economic element of medicine becoming kind of problematic for you. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I started my career in medicine as a candy striper in the 1960s in the emergency room at Temple Hospital, which is an urban inner city hospital. And then I went there to medical school, and I did my residency there. So I learned a lot during those times about what people were experiencing, they were mostly African American and Latino people, and living in poverty. So I knew something about that. And I think one of the questions you asked is, what was the thing that happened that got you into this? And I was thinking about that. And when I was a candy striper in the ER, what I remember most of all, I remember holding somebody's head while the doc was sewing them up after being stabbed. And the other thing I remembered was a young child, a toddler, being brought in who had been immersed in boiling water. And those images never really left me, but I didn't know anything about that yet. And then medical school, then my residency, and then I went out to practice. And I went out to practice in a community that was all white, middle class. And that's really where I learned about trauma. Really learned. Because I had a private practice and we had created an inpatient unit, and each one of us, we had a team of people, and each one of us had these riveting experiences with specific patients that helped us understand that our ideas about where mental illness was coming from were just wrong. And and that these were all people who had sustained serious injuries, not physical, psychological, as children. And then their pathways had become really skewed because of the ways they had adapted to those original injuries.
Mm.
And that was, it's what we're talking now, 1980, 82, somewhere around there, 83, 84, where this was revolutionary information.
Mm.
This was a complete shift. Up until that point, for the prior 10 years, it had all been about, in psychiatry, it had all been about neurotransmitters and what drugs to put people on. And we saw that wasn't, that they could help, but that was not the issue. The issue was really how they had been abused as kids. And these were all adults. And that changed everything. I mean, that was, that made my life go on a completely unexpected path. I thought I was going to be in that community for the rest of my life, practicing, doing psychiatry, had a really nice house. That was just what was going to be, and had lots of animals, pets, dogs. And that's not how things worked out at all, because this was just really new information about basic causality, about where mental illness is coming from. And I started meeting other people who understood that in the International Society for Traumatic Stress. And they were working largely with Vietnam vets and Holocaust survivors and disaster victims. So the notion that so many people had been experiencing these bad things as children was just coming into awareness. And we moved our program in 1980, and 1980, I forget, late 80s. We had to move our program. No, 92, I guess. We had to move it because there were huge problems at the top with the organization, the hospital that we were in. And I was on the board at that point because my program was essential to them economically. And I couldn't stay there anymore. So we moved in 92 to a private psychiatric hospital. And then we had to move again in 92, 95 to another hospital. And then again, we had to move to another hospital. And all of these were because the healthcare system was changing. And I had absolutely no control over this, but everything was being reduced. In our original program, we had creative therapies every day, sometimes twice a day. And it had gotten to the point where we couldn't have them at all. The time that people could spend in the hospital just kept reducing and reducing and reducing. And we had only started out with about 2 weeks, so it wasn't like they were there for months and months. But that kept, so it was down to 2 days. And it just became impossible to go on doing what we thought was good. We knew was good work because our patients recovered. They didn't just, get stabilized. They actually often had transformative experiences in their lives and became whole. And it became impossible to go on doing that. And that's how I learned about, so I wrote my first book about creating sanctuary, about the development of the program. And then I wrote a book called Bearing Witness, because I'd become involved in my city in the kind of the whole community aspect of what are we going to do to it was about collective violence. And then my third book was Destroying Sanctuary, because I had learned so much about how dysfunctional our systems are, all the way in parallel, all the way up to the top. And I had learned a lot about it. So I wrote about what I learned. And then because I had written, Sanctuary became known out in the social service world. And I had the opportunity with a colleague in a residential program in New York to start a training institute. And the Sanctuary Institute was started in 2005. And I left there in 2016, as did my director, Sarah Yanissi. We both left on the same day at the same time because of similar problems that just kept happening over and over and over again. And, I think that's why Gay asked me to be on this, because, our organizations, no matter what it is you're doing, are really struggling to be safe, to be whole, to be able to do whatever the work is that's there to do, because up against such enormous odds that, in November just got a lot worse. So then, but Sarah and I couldn't let it rest. So during COVID, we created Creating Presence, which is a online organizational approach with tracks for an introductory track that everybody has to do. And then it divides into leadership, clinicians, indirect service, and direct service workers. And it's all online with coaching from Sarah and some of our other colleagues. And to try to get a whole organization on what it means to really be trauma informed and trauma responsive. So presence, we use that word because we use it as an acronym. So the P stands for partnership and power. The R is for reverence and restoration. The first D is for emotional wisdom and empathy. The S is for safety and social responsibility. The second D is for embodiment and enactment. The N is for nature and nurture. The C is for culture and complexity. And the third E is for emergence and evolution. And I keep my fingers crossed on that we will actually have a chance to evolve. And I think it's around those values where Gay and I found a lot of simpatico.
Yeah.
I'd say. That's one question, Olivia. I took it.
I'm glad you did. That's such an incredible arc, and I think so much of the series has been following people in their individual life trajectories to doing the work that they feel they were here to do. And I think everything you just shared speaks so well to that, and just the different paths life takes and the turns that you find yourself on. You mentioned the transformative experiences that you witnessed people having before you left the hospital. Is there any specific experience that you had with that or individual you met in this space that you'd want to share with us today?
Sure. There were so many. The one that was so critical for me was a young woman who I started seeing when she was 18. She was sent to me. I knew her mom. I had worked with her mom, who was a nurse, and she came to me because she had accused a man on her college campus, of raping her. And the police investigated. Sorry. The police investigated, and it hadn't happened. And at least not the way she described it. And even when I talked to her, it didn't make sense. The story didn't make sense. I didn't know what to make of that. I didn't know what that meant. And I just started doing what I did in those days, the psychotherapy that I did with her. And I met with her every week got to know her really well. She was a delight. She was warm and intelligent and a lovely person. And I worked with her for several years. There'd be, whenever she'd go out on a date, I might get an emergency call. And she'd just be upset. And I'd calm her down, and then she'd say, okay, I'll see you next week. Thank you, and we get off. I don't know if I ever checked back. I don't really know. I don't remember with her about those incidents, but she finished college and went to another city for graduate school and got back into therapy and stayed in touch with me. Not that frequently, just kind of cards and stuff. And one day I get an emergency call from her mother that she's now 23, and her mother says she's suicidal, and she's using drugs, no previous history of addiction. Could her mom bring her down and be hospitalized again? And I said, yes, of course. And that's the day my life changed, when I walked into the room to see her, because I opened the door and I was shocked. And I think what I was shocked by was the way she was moving, the way she was sitting and the way she was moving. She just looked like a little girl. And it was so striking that I said, hi, how old are you? And she said, I'm 7. And I went, ruh-roh. That's, oh dear. So I knew what that was. I watched movies, I watched Three Faces of Eve. I knew about Sybil, but this is somebody I know that I thought I knew as well as anybody in anybody.
Yeah.
And over the course of the next week or two, this 7-year-old part of her revealed her history of incest with her father, who had died just a year prior to her first entering treatment of diabetes. And I was completely staggered by this. And we did good work with her, and we did, she reenacted all of the stuff that was causing so much pain for her. And, I knew that somehow Humpty Dumpty had to go back together again, that the part of her that was the grown-up had to remember and know and feel all of this stuff of the 7-year-old. And we managed to, as far as I could see, accomplish that while she was in the hospital. But I was a complete mess. I was a really experienced psychiatrist by that time, and I just could not believe that I could have missed this big glaring. And then each one of us, and my friend Joe was a social worker, and for him, the signature person was a teenager who laid down in the road to get run over by a school bus. And she didn't get run over. And she too had these different personality states which had to be integrated. My person ended up finishing graduate school and going on and becoming an educator. His person recovered and went on and became a successful businesswoman. And for my friend Ruth Ann, who was a clinical nurse specialist, her signature patient was a young woman who was the mother of 2 children, who was caught shoplifting by the police in front of her 2 little girls. And then she made a really serious suicide attempt. And so we first spoke to her when she was in ICU. And Ruth Ann worked with her. She had scars all over her body from self-harming. And Ruth Ann worked with her for a long time. And she did really well and went back to school and went to college and got an advanced degree and became a therapist, so
Mm.
I have enough time in this to know people can recover if they
Yeah.
get what they need.
Mhm.
But those were the three that really kind of stood out to me because they were the earliest people that we really saw go from beginning, recognizing this all the way through to getting well.
Yeah. Wow, that's really staggering, I guess, to hear those stories and what you all were dealing with. And the arc now that you talked about to today, where you're teaching about all this that you've learned over your life, and you were saying in the beginning of our conversation how you think the students are the ones who are starting to come around to what you're teaching, but that generally you stand out a little bit from your colleagues at the university. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that and maybe any other sticking points that you're encountering now after the arc of your career?
Sure. The Yeah, it's really, I really enjoy teaching the students, especially the undergraduates. I'm just I'm just doing the grading now.
Mm.
And they're so rewarding because they don't come in with a whole lot of um bias already. They're
Mm.
open. And my particular class this year, these kids, their families are from all over the world.
Mm.
Um, I don't know. I don't know if they're first or second generation, but I can just tell from their names that they're from everywhere, and when they introduce themselves. And I teach them from a kind of a survey course around trauma and what it means that begins with its introduction and then history, and it goes from there all the way up through what it does to people, what it does to families, then what it does to communities, and what it does to organizations. So they get a pretty vast um, knowledge base, and I
Mm.
and I use reading and videos and lectures that I've filmed. And I'm just so moved by what happens in the process of learning about all this, that they really clearly articulate that their worldview has changed as a
Mm.
result, which is my goal, right? And that they're just so startled, by how much trauma and when it begins, and how many children are suffering and how the suffering has to be relieved. And so that's what's so gratifying for me, is watching that change happen over the course of 10 weeks. And, because I think the most important thing is that everybody needs this knowledge. It shouldn't be confined to professional corridors. This should be general public
Mm.
information. Everybody should know that 70% of the population of the United States have experienced childhood adversity.
Mm.
That should not be a secret,
Yeah.
because everybody is going to be encountering people that have had bad things happen to them when they were children.
Mm.
Everybody is. You can't get, if it's 70% or more of the population, then they're everywhere. So we all have to be prepared to know what that means and what we're seeing and how to be most helpful, how to respond most helpfully.
Mm.
And when it comes to the tie-in with what you guys are all really focused on, um, I think about attitudes toward children being very similar to attitudes towards nature and
Mm.
animals. And there's just no rights. We are the
Mm.
only country in the world that has failed to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. That's significant. The only country in the world. And I think it's very closely aligned to, to trying to protect nature and why, what you're up against. It's not just you're up against, caring about animals and caring about nature. It's that it's also about caring about children. And that's such a trigger point for so many people, for at least 70% of the population.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned a minute ago what could be possible if this was just common knowledge and we all knew what to do with this knowledge, how to treat each other. Is there anything that you would suggest that our audience and ourselves can maybe start to incorporate these things into our lives, for those who aren't already maybe familiar with your with creating presence and what you teach?
I think I think everybody can. I think that Sarah and I were doing a podcast this morning before I came on, and we were talking about the bystander effect and how we are all bystanders at some point in our life, often quite frequently. And what do we do? Do we do nothing, or do we do something? Do we say something about how what's going on isn't okay? So what's so disturbing right now is the amount of hate that is being broadcast everywhere, all over the place, that people are exposed to. And it's addictive. And I think all of us, if we don't yet, we're going to have an opportunity to say, I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable about talking in that divided way. I'm not comfortable with how this conversation is going. And everybody works in organizations. And I think trying to do what we can to practice healthy methods in our own organizations. And I'm kind of constantly shocked at how even very well-educated people don't know how to solve problems, don't know what to do when a conflict arises. Just don't know that we're not learning in schools a lot of the skills we need to learn to be able to go out into the workplace and be effective with each other and not harmful to each other, and still get the jobs done. I don't think kids are learning it. And I'm talking about every generation. So I just had to mediate with two of my neighbors who are very well-educated, successful people. But it's about, how do you manage a conflict? So I think those tools, that's what we're trying to do with presence, is teach a lot of those just basic skills, get people thinking in a different way about what's going on and why, and interacting in a different way, and creating environments that are more supportive of health rather than our current environments, which are all too often only supportive of more dysfunction. And that's going on at every level of our society, all the way up. It's really discouraging.
Absolutely. And the organizations that creating presences for are any organizations, or one specifically doing anything?
I mean, because that's part of what the sanctuary was very much focused on, mental health organizations. And what we've realized is that, the dysfunction we're talking about is everywhere. And it doesn't matter whether it's a nonprofit, for-profit, doesn't matter. People are going to be having trouble in the workplace. And so it's really aimed at anywhere. And that, everybody needs to understand this basic knowledge about trauma and adversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the transformation that'd be possible if that was just the given in the world.
Yeah. Can you imagine? I can imagine. I'm a Trekkie, so I can imagine what the future could look like.
How does that look to you? What do you see when you think of that?
I love that show because it is the only show that gives us a vision of what a future could be that isn't based on how rich people have to get, where there's no money, there's no, there's they created synthesizers, so everybody is fed and everybody has clothing and everybody has what they want, what they need. But it's only happened after World War III. It's important to realize, I think, given where we are.
Yes. Yeah, the good that can come eventually.
Yes, exactly.
So you were discussing earlier when you were sharing your arc, the different places that you worked and had to leave and just the ins and outs of that. Do you see, and it sounded the way that you spoke about it over this conversation was that these decisions to leave different organizations and environments were intentional to bring you more aligned with the work that you were doing. Was this, I guess what I'm trying to ask is if that was intentional in the moment, or were there things that you felt that you were giving up in these experiences to pursue this path, or was this kind of the way it unfolded, and in hindsight you see the arc?
In hindsight, I see the arc that has happened. I wouldn't say it was intentional. It was each change was a huge loss. So, and I think what we learned as a whole team, we use this notion we call self, and it stands for safety, emotions, loss, and future. And we learned that those were, we think of those as a compass, and they're the compass points, and you move it around. You can use it as a problem solving tool, as a conflict management tool. And we often have people start with the future. What do you want the future to look like? What are you going to have to give up in order to get to that future? That's the loss part. What are the emotions that are crowding in, and what do you got to do to be safe enough to even work through the emotions and work through the loss to get to the future? That's how they interact with each other. So each move meant a lot of loss, because we would have these really tight, wonderful teams with our clinical team and our nursing staff, but the nursing staff were hired by the hospital, and it was the clinical team that was moving on. So each time we moved, we'd have to separate from these people we were really, really loved and depended upon. Have to move into new places, have to make all new connections again. It was a lot of loss. But it's what kept us alive for 20 years. And we learned a lot in that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you sharing that, because I think that is something that we've been hearing from a lot of our guests this year, is that in the pursuit, whether knowingly or unknowingly, of their path in life, there's been a lot that's lost along the way, and that as you're looking back on it, you can kind of see what was gained in these moments and why the loss was necessary. But I think in the point of the series to help people kind of align with their work in the world, I think it's I appreciate you sharing that it's not all just like rosy all the time in this way. There is difficulty and loss along the way.
No, definitely. That's absolutely true. And I think you have to develop a really philosophical approach to that whole issue, because you can't know ahead of time how things are going to turn out. So I don't know if, Gay, did you tell me the story about Marlon Brando? Did you tell me that story?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, I've told everybody I can. So
Tell
do
it
they
again.
already, do they? Okay.
No, tell it
I
again.
love this story. Because see if I get it right. So Marlon Brando, who famous actor, and he was in a workshop, an acting workshop, and the director said, "Okay, you're all chickens, and a nuclear attack has just been launched. So go ahead." So everybody's running around screaming, clucking, waving their hands, and the director looks at Marlon Brando, and he's squatting in the middle of the room. And he goes up to him and he says, "Marlon, what are you doing?" And Marlon says, "I'm a chicken. I'm laying an egg. That's what chickens do. What do I give a shit whether there's been a nuclear launch?" And I love that story because that's what I feel like. I feel like I'm just laying eggs. And that's my responsibility, is to keep on laying eggs. And I can't do anything about who got elected president of the United States, but I can go on laying eggs, and that's what I'm doing. And I think a lot of my friends have taken great comfort in that story.
I see why. It's kind of like a more fun one foot in front of the other, just one
Exactly.
egg at a time. That's fantastic. Oh, that's great, Sandy. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to share with us before we move into the Q&A portion?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. I mean, we'll switch over. I'm sure everybody has lots they'd like to ask. And I think I know Gay does. So we'll start with her, and everyone else is welcome to type in the chat, or I think we have a small enough group here we can also unmute ourselves in a little bit if that's easier. But Gay, go ahead, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for the entree, Sandy. And I think also, just to sort of go on a little bit about that, but within presence, you have mindfulness, and so I think, just to emphasize the depth, it's not as if the chicken or you or me or whatever are not paying attention to this broader drama, the dramas that are going on. It's, really bringing us into being in place and to use Charlie Russell's term, fitting in. Certainly the chicken is going to do something, if other chickens are being affected or other, what I mean? It's not just this sort of, blinders on, or, what you mentioned, bystander, like, well, that's their problem, I got to do mine. So I think you brought up a really important point about that. And of course, we're so excited that you and Sarah have deigned to collaborate with us on creating presence with nature. This is a little blurb. It's on our website, our new website, and it's a collaboration, and it's really bringing the work of presence and all of the history and experience of Sandy and Sarah into the realm of the integrated human nature realm. And the point of it is really to understand that a lot of the issues and problems and consternation that goes on regarding animals, trees, and the rest of nature is really poorly framed, and it's poorly understood, because that 99.9, well, I would say 100% of the problems are human problems, whether it's direct causality or it's in terms of the perception and the framing. And so really the purpose of creating presence, which is so wonderful, as I said, it's a template for all of the world, seriously, is to expand its place. So many of the individuals and organizations, and I think maybe Sandy, you can, this is that question, is maybe you can actually speak a little bit more, but like you said, sort of traditionally or conventionally, the work of sanctuary and presence are in quote unquote mental health in the institution, social services, but really it's much broader than that. Like you said, everyone should be aware of it. Everyone should have exposure and some training and experience in this area. And And that's really saying, I think also conventionally, we still have, at least in this country, I mean, everyone's watched, perhaps everyone or a lot of people have watched Woody Allen's, Annie Hall and whatever, everyone has a therapist in California type of thing. But there's still a lot of stigma in terms of mental health and quote unquote mental health, or however you want to put it, and trauma in particular is embedded in everyone who is involved in making decisions about and having perceptions about non-human nature. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that whole notion of, even bringing presence out of the, as you called it, the corridors, certain corridors, and understanding it as a worldview.
Yeah, and that's I think what's so dramatic about the trauma knowledge is it really is a paradigm shift. And it changes everything about the way you think and the way you feel and what you do. So that, that's why I think it's so important that it be universal. Because I don't think there's any hope for the species unless we make that shift, unless we really understand that the reason that we are so screwed up is it's thousands of years of repetitive trauma beginning in childhood. This is not new. The only thing that's new is that now we realize it. But that it's been happening is anything but new. It is just a fundamental part of, I know Western culture better than any other culture, but it's a fundamental part of Western culture. I think the Native Americans dealt with children and women in a different way. But once the Europeans came over here, everything became what we've got. And I think it's so important for people to realize that there is this very deep history of intergenerational traumatic experience that has to be undone. We all have to recover from. And it's nobody's fault now. Nobody created this mess. No, it's not of this generation, although this generation is manifesting it. It goes deeper and deeper and deeper, far into our past. And out of our past has come some really good things and some really bad things. And so we have a lot of cleanup to do. And instead of understanding that, we're becoming more and more and more divided in this country. I think because it's information that is so threatening to the status quo. And of course it will mean economic change. It has to. We can't go on this way. We are not going to survive climate change unless something is done dramatically and soon. Nothing is going to survive. Not even those very rich billionaires. They're not going to survive either. And they don't seem to get that. So I think that's why it's so important to get more people over to understanding what this paradigm shift is, moving the worldview to recognize and for what all of you guys are committed to, we're all connected. Not only are we all humans connected, but humans are connected to every other aspect of nature. And that's part of the paradigm shift that arises, that you learn when you learn about your own body and how it's affected by stress and how animals are too, and how, wow, so are plants. You have a different way of understanding the world that is much more likely, if we have the chance, to lead to some useful solutions instead of this divided path we're currently on, where there are, good people and bad people, black people and white people, men and women, all the divisions that we are feeding on now. It's a bad time. It's a really bad time.
I think, actually, with the turning of the year, we're going to be kind of going into a new series, and a large part of it is explicitly, philosophical, as you called it, philosophical and perceptual change. And typically, in circles, in can-do circles, let's get the problem, then let's not one another philosophy. We don't need that. But that's essentially what you're talking about, is we have to really start with the ground of a philosophical reboot.
Yep, exactly.
At a fundamental level, and understand that, get familiar with that. And of course, that's, why artwork intersects and why we're developing, mindfulness and meditation. And from our perspective, and it has actually shared from a number of teachers, that trauma and the profound stress that we are experiencing and that we saw in the elephants is that deviation, that departure from a healthful baseline.
Yep.
So essentially, that's really, we're kind of rebooting back into that. And so I really appreciate you talking about the need to reflect, the need to understand a philosophy, that there are techniques, there are trainings, but it's within, that's putting into practice this philosophical foundation.
Thank you so much, Gabe, for your question and for that conversation. Would anyone else like to ask or comment anything at this point?
Yeah, I guess I would like to say something, because as I shared with Sandy, I have worked in this sanctuary model. And so I'm familiar with it in an organization, working with adolescents in the foster care system, just to give context to how I've utilized it. But interesting for me, Sandy, is when you're talking about in the 80s, when I was in the 80s, I was working in a juvenile prison in Wisconsin with, I was middle-class white American, and I was in this prison with a demographic and a world that was unfamiliar to me. And I remember sitting there talking to 16-year-old, kids that had done horrific things, that had killed somebody, or a 12-year-old that had been a prostitute thrown out of a building and was going to go back, to that life. And what I realized then is the humanness in all of this, right? I can't sit there and view my values from this white middle-class place. I need to just meet these people where they were, right? And I think the thing that I learned in that is, and I would say this about all my work in the varying different degrees and places and mine's all been with kids, is that now I totally lost my train of thought, but you have to get outside yourself, and you have to, the only way sanctuary works, the only way presence works, the only way mindfulness works, the only way all of these things work is you have to go back inside yourself.
Yep.
You can't be a therapist. You can't help people. You can't be a parent to your children who are experiencing these great traumas if you haven't done your own work and your own healing. And I've unfortunately been in a lot of organizations, and organizations themselves and the people that work there that haven't done their work. And I've left because of that. I stopped being a drug and alcohol counselor because I needed to deal with what alcohol did in my family as a child. Well, I can't tell a kid to, hey, if I'm not willing to do the same thing I'm asking. And so therein lies part of the fundamental dysfunction of the entire system. And that's also as organizations. And so I won't say anything more about that. But that to me is why this is, I'm 1,000% bought into, this is important for everybody, right? And the only way we're going to heal the younger generation, which is our future, is we have to heal the wounds and this older generation in order to allow them to blossom and bloom and become all of who they can be.
That's right.
The one, and the reframing and all of that. And to me, it's a day-to-day thing. I can, the one question, I think it was when I was learning sanctuary, was when you see somebody doing something, whether it's a behavior, whether it's an emotion, whether it's whatever it is, the question's not what's wrong with you. The question is what's happened to you. And if we all went through the world with that as our response, and even to ourselves,
right,
as our response to what we perceive as outrageous, unjustified, whatever it is, we ask what has happened. That totally reframes, that totally allows for a whole different response and opens up potential that until we do that is never going to happen. And so, like, working with the self model, and again, you can't, I've heard 5-year-olds say the most incredible answers to how they're feeling that blew my mind. So don't tell me that kids can't identify, and if they're in those environments, they can. So I find this profound. It was in working in trauma, and I worked in trauma for 20 plus years. That's what led me to Kerulos, because I saw these elephants with such trauma, but they figured out as a collective society and as individuals how to heal. And we need to learn from that. And your presence and your sanctuary, like, you embody so many of those same natural things in the wording, although I still think we have meaning making to happen in that. But again, Sandy, I said this to you earlier, and I'll say it again, like, thank you for your work, because there's so much in this, and we're just at the cusp now of unlocking the door, and for people to really understand, because we are all trauma.
Right. Exactly.
So thank you.
You got it. Thank you. Yes.
Do you find the traumatic situation that you are familiar with in traditional societies and indigenous societies around the world that are really indigenous, the ones that are left, like in the Amazon and some of those traditional societies that still function apart from the influence of this so-called civilization?
Yeah, Mike, I don't feel like I'm any kind of authority on indigenous methods and what they do. What I have been impressed with, I've been reading lately a lot about who the Iroquois people were when settlers first came here, and their method of governing, and the way how women were included and children were respected. And they created 6 tribes, came together to create the Iroquois and the Great Law of Peace. And I've learned something about that, which has been inspiring for me, because I live close to those lands, those original lands, and to imagine. And they had conversations with Jefferson, Washington, Benjamin Franklin, spent a lot of time with them. The founders, supposedly, our Constitution was in part based on what the Iroquois government was like. And we seem to have forgotten that. That doesn't get much mention, but it's the truth. So in terms of the other indigenous people to the Maori in Australia and New Zealand, and the folks you're talking about I just don't know enough, Mike, to comment. I suspect that it's hard to get accurate information that who people originally were because of the colonization effects, but I think there's enough oral memory left in many of the cultures that are left for us to try to recapture that. You may know more than I know about some of those cultures. That's the best answer I got, Mike.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think a lot of the problem when you move from an animistic belief system to a monotheistic religious system really set the the standards for moving forward with things like the Industrial Revolution and things that led to the lack of respect between humans and nature, and the breakdown in humanity itself, and the treatment of indigenous people when they colonized, and the slave trade and all that sort of thing. Do you think monotheism started the ball rolling on that in a way?
Yes. Yes, Mike. I do. I think it's been a really huge problem, especially because God's supposedly a man, which doesn't make any sense at all. I think, and there's a really good book you might find interesting if you haven't read it. It's called The Weirdest People in the World. And weird stands for Western, industrialized, educated, rich, democratic. And the author makes a very good case, interesting case, that how all of the tribal cultures, I think what distinguishes indigenous folks that you're talking about is that they are tribal. And that means pretty small groups of people, usually not large cities, but smaller groups of people who depend on each other and who often are moving around, or hunter-gatherers. He makes the case that that's what existed in Europe when the Romans came. And he really goes through details about how the Roman Catholic Church systematically destroyed all of the tribal cultures throughout Europe in order to get everybody under the same umbrella. And certainly the monotheistic umbrella that you're referring to. So it's very interesting when you read that, because I did, when I read it, I went, oh, that's what happened to my people. Because I'm totally English, Welsh, and Irish. So that's what happened. And it's really interesting. It's a very interesting book. I highly recommend it. I think Cecilia's got her hand up. You got to turn your mic on. That's the Zoom thing.
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah, now we got
good. Yeah. I wanted to say that I agree that logically it would be best if one could heal oneself first before trying to help others. But I think that it's like we're in a war, and I think we need to do everything we can, and so to work on healing ourselves, yes, and do what we can to help others. Take whatever steps we can to help others, to report things, to support people who are abused, who have been abused. And I'm closely tracking Russia's war on Ukraine. I do think that's the biggest thing that's been happening in the world, the most serious. And I think we could learn from them. I notice there that the Ukrainian units will often have a dog or a cat, in their forward line units, in the trenches and all. And they do so much to try to support each other. And I saw a piece about some Ukrainian fighters who, because of some American donations, were able to take a break for 5 days and go into the mountains with a bunch of therapists and, art therapists and people, and be in community and all, and try to process. And I just think we might be able to learn a lot from them in that regard too. What they've found to support each other. It's really an amazing thing. And what I hope doesn't happen is that, we,
Yeah, I know.
as kind of privileged Americans, just keep wanting to, well, I have to be all healed and I have to go through 15 years of therapy and I need this and I need that. And I also need to be perfectly safe before I'm going to stick my head out and try anything. There's sometimes we're demanding, and
Yeah,
I do feel like it's all hands on deck. Go ahead.
I think, yes, I agree with you. I think helping ourselves to heal and helping others are hand in glove, just like you're describing. And in terms of the social transformation, Celia, I wrote a paper many years ago called The Social Transformation of Trauma, and it has lots of other examples that you might enjoy of people, different groups and different people that have done that, with different kinds of traumatic experiences. And it's on the Creating Presence website, or Sanctuary web. I don't know what the hell website. It's on one of my websites, something I have. It's there. It's a paper I wrote. That's what it's called. The Social Transformation of Trauma.
Thank you so much. I would also just like to comment that I so appreciate the imperfection of how you present yourself and your information. I so appreciate it. I'm so sick of everybody online who's giving a talk is all perfect and blonde and has their skin and body redone and they're clearly a success, the big success. I'm sick of that. I want us to get back to a human standard.
Well, thank you, Celia.
Yes.
I'm glad you appreciate it.
I really do. As an old imperfect person who feels too ashamed sometimes to stick my neck out because I
do it anyhow,
Yeah.
Especially to the young. They need to know what we know. They need that. They need to know.
Yes, even if we're not head of Google or something.
Exactly.
Yes.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you for your questions and your comments. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Mike, you're still unmuted. Was there something else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I wonder, I'm a veterinarian, so I find that people that experience a lot of trauma really do well when they listen to their animals. And I don't know if you use support animals with your clients or not, but cats and dogs and goats and horses and pigs and cows can do amazing things for people if they'll listen to them.
So true. I have 2 dogs, Mike. I never had the opportunity to use animals in my work because they were always in hospitals, and they wouldn't let animals in, and I didn't have service animals, but I've always had dogs. And I have 2 dogs now. One's a puppy. Well, she's a little over a year, and her first heat. That's quite challenging because I have a Ridgeback down the road who is way too interested, if you know what I mean. And I have an 11-year-old. They're both Belgian Terrorants. And my 11-year-old comes and sits in front of me and stares at me until I hear what she's saying. It's very clear that she's talking to me. And I have learned to listen because it's a big mistake not to listen. And it's the same with the puppy. She comes and she'll do something and I go, what is it? And the other night I had taken them both out. I had gone to bed. I'd gotten into bed and I went, oh no, the puppy still wants to go out. And I got dressed again, came down, went outside, took her outside. And sure enough, she had to go because I was finally listening to her. So I know exactly what you mean. I agree with you. And I don't have that much experience with other animals, but I sure have had a lot of experience with dogs. And I know they talk to me all the time.
Yeah, and everything we can learn from them. All right, would anyone else like to add anything or ask a question before we wrap up today? All right, well, if not, Sandy, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's been such an incredible conversation. I've learned so much, and it's just been wonderful chatting with you.
Thanks, Olivia. And thanks to all of you for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. All right. Next week, or actually our next Living One speaker is going to be on Monday, just in a couple of days. And that will be our last speaker in this series for 2024. So we hope you'll all join us. We will be joined by Betty Kovacs, who is the author of Merchants of Light, The Consciousness That Is Changing the World, and The Miracle of Death, There's Nothing But Life. And she will be joining us again this Monday, December 9th at 1 p.m. Pacific time. So not our usual time. It's on Monday, the 9th at 1 p.m. And as always, if you enjoy Living One and feel called to support Kerulos, Living One, and all of our sanctuary residents, please consider donating at the link on our website, kerulos.org. And thank you all again for being here. Thank you so much, Sandy. We hope to see you all soon.
Okay, bye. Happy
Bye.
holidays.
Thank you.